Yes, it was on October 25th, 1992, just before the presidential elections in November. And he had asked to see me because I had written the book in 1989, Trend Tracking. And in that book, I had forecast that there would be a new third party in the United States. And for some reason, I mentioned Ross Perot in talking about it. And of course, Ross Perot got almost 20% of the vote in that 92 election. And Connally wanted to meet me. He wanted to know how I figured that out and what I thought was going to happen next. So I flew to Dallas to have lunch with him.
And what was his role at that stage?
He had lost a lot of money, actually. The oil boom had unwound. He was on a couple of board of directors for some oil companies, and he was living in a condominium that they put him up in. He had lost a lot of everything.
Okay.
And by the way, just to preface this, I never liked Connally from what I knew about him in the media. But, I wanted to meet him. I mean, after all, this is the guy that took the bullet in the back sitting in front of Kennedy, and then he became the Treasury Secretary as a Republican under Richard Nixon. And he was also the guy during his tenure when the United States went off the gold standard officially under Connally. So I wanted to meet him. And we were having lunch at the Anatole Hotel, myself and three other people. And as I'm listening to him speak, Ian, the first emotion that ran through me was embarrassment. I was embarrassed that I prejudged someone that I didn't know and only heard about in the media. And every word that he was speaking sounded, it was like a sentence, and every sentence like a paragraph. And I was actually cutting, the other people that started to talk, I started cutting them off, and I was a stranger in the group, a guy from the Bronx and Yonkers, sitting with these politicians and all these people. And I wanted to hear more of what he had to say. It was one of those things, I wish I had a tape recorder moment. Anyway, we finished lunch, and this fella, John J. Hooker from Tennessee, actually, it's the Hooker. His great-great-great-great-great-great uncle was the hooker that brought the camp girls around during the Civil War.
Oh.
That's how they got the name hookers. Yeah.
Goodness
and
me.
his brother was very big in the Hospital Corporation of America, one of those big firms, and he had just run for governor of Tennessee and barely lost. And he was a gadfly at the time against the campaign financing systems. And so anyway, Hooker says, well, John, the limousine's waiting. And myself, and there was Pat Cadell, who was a pollster for Perot at the time, and he was also the pollster under Jimmy Carter, and a woman by the name of Rama Fox, who was Larry King's girlfriend. Now, Larry King, if people remember, Perot announced his candidacy on Larry King. And John J. Hooker was the guy that made the whole thing happen. So we all pile into a limousine along with his wife, Nellie. And this is their first time back to the book depository since the assassination.
And we should remind people that Nellie was in that car that day, so that the people in the car were the Secret Service, John Connally and his wife Nellie, the President and Gcelente Kennedy. So they're now going back, the survivors of the assassination are now going back with you on the route they haven't taken for nearly 30 years.
Correct. They didn't even go to when they made the book depository a museum. They didn't even go back there for that. So now we're sitting there in the front of the book depository, and I sent you a photo of me, him, and his wife, Nellie, and you can see the window that ostensibly Lee Harvey Oswald shot from. And we're parked out in the front, and I'm sitting across from Connally in the limousine, and the other people are flanking on either sides. And Connally starts telling the story what happened that day. He said, I heard a gunshot. And he said, I turned to my left, to my right, I don't remember exactly which one. And he said, I know it was a gunshot because I've been hunting since I'm a little boy. Now, when he looked over, that was the grassy knoll he looked over to. And he said, I was wearing a dark blue suit that day, and I was all scrunched up in the jump seat. You go back to the 1960s, where limousines weren't like they are now. They had these little jump seats that folded down, and he was a tall guy. And he showed how he was scrunched up, holding his Stetson hat on his knee. And he said, I was wearing a dark blue suit that day. And I turned to my left, and there were brains on my shoulder.
Oh, God.
He said, I know they were brains because my daddy was a butcher.
Oh, God.
And then he went on, and both he and Nellie told about, they heard 3 shots. And what happened was he makes two he has 2 fists, and he said, I felt a pounding on my back, and that's when the bullet ripped through his back, and his face contorted. He said, and I went flying forward, and Nellie threw herself on top of him. Now, remember what this looks like. There's a big man scrunched up in a jump seat. His hat is on his knee. The bullet goes through his back, through his hand, through his hat, through his knee, and out. He goes flying forward. His wife falls on top of him, jumps on top of him. And he said, we got to Parkland Hospital maybe in about 10 minutes. He said, it's usually a 20-minute drive. Sam Kellerman, whatever the hell the guy's name was driving that day. What happened was, as the motorcade is screaming into Parkland Hospital, remember, Connally's telling the story. There's a doctor that was on break, and he sees the motorcade come screaming in. He runs down to the emergency room, and it happens to be a thoracic surgeon. And Connally just got his lungs blown out. So the odds of that happening are, next to nothing. So what happens is that because Nellie was laying on top of him, his hand is compressed against the wound. That's what saved his life, he said.
Gosh. Because
the air would have gone in through the lung wound, and he would have suffocated. We go outside, we take some pictures. A woman, this Rama Fox, had a Polaroid camera. That's what that photo is. And all of a sudden, this is Sunday afternoon. There was nobody there. All of a sudden, hundreds of people. So there's John Connally. There's John Connally. He's very gracious. We get back in the car, and we're driving back. And again, I'm sitting across from him.
By the way, Gerald Celente, did he go up into the room and actually have a look where the shot had been fired, or could he not bring himself to go into the building?
No. We were parked out in front, and we went out. We never went inside. We just went out to the to Dealey Plaza and walked around a little bit. But no, he didn't go inside at all. And so we're in the car, and I'm looking at him, and I said to myself, this is a dying man. And I knew he was dying because my father, may his soul rest in peace, died of asbestos poisoning from working in the shipyards during World War II. And they had him on heavy doses of prednisone. As Connally's talking, I'm looking at his hands, and they look like my dad's hands before he passed on. They had all these big purple splotches on them. Connally's wound was acting up. I think he had adhesions or something, and they had him on heavy doses of prednisone. If you look at the photo of me and him and his wife, you could see he's hunched over. And he was a very tall, stately guy at one time. So as I'm looking at him, I said, I've seen this picture before. Matter of fact, I ended up telling Hooker the next day, I said, Connally's going to die soon. He said, what are you talking about, Gerald, my boy? I said, no, look, I've seen this before. This guy's on this heavy doses of prednisone. He's not going to make it. I watched my father die. So what happens is, Ian, we're going back into the hotel. Remember, I'm sitting in the middle. His wife is on one side of him, Rama Fox on the other. To my left, Hooker, and my right, Pat Cadell. Everybody gets out. We're the last 2 to get out. We're walking into the Anatole Hotel, and he stops and he looks at me. He said, I read your book, Trend Tracking. He said, it's a fine piece of work. He said, you know your stuff. He said, and I know your heart's in the right place. He said, but you don't have a clue what's going on in the government. And neither did the American people. Because if they did, there'd be a revolution in this country.
That's a remarkable story, Gerald, but let's go back to that day itself when he turned up, President Kennedy, in Dallas. I mean, there was almost a revolution, wasn't there? Because the president said to his aide, we're heading into nut country, and he actually told Jacqueline Kennedy that he feared for his life that day. So the Dallas region was revolting against the government effectively that day, and a lot of people thought it took place in Dallas because Dallas hated the president so much.
I hear what you're saying, but when you go back to 1992 and you think of what was going on at that time, it looked like Clinton and Gore were going to win, and they were the baby boomers, and there was an excitement about it. There was also an excitement that the Cold War was finally over. There was an excitement that the digital revolution was just beginning, and the United States was leading it. To say that there would be a revolution in this country in '92, you were speaking a foreign language. People just, but by this time I had already become a political atheist. And again, what I wrote in trend tracking back in '89 was heresy.
Well, then, what was Connally talking about? Was he talking about the arrival of George Bush, so that who we know came from an oil family, we know he came from Texas? I mean, wouldn't he have been happy about that? No,
because Connally, as I saw it, as I said to you, my first reaction when he was speaking at lunch was I was embarrassed, for prejudging him. I felt like a dope. This guy was speaking from his heart. We stayed in contact, by the way, until April of 1993, and then he died in June. And, as I took it, only he was speaking like a dying man, and he loved the country. And it broke his heart to see what was happening to it.
What did he feel was happening?
It was an entire takeover by both the bankers and the military-industrial complex. It was out of the hands of the people. And remember who this guy was. This guy was the Treasury Secretary under Nixon, by the way, who was the guy that went and told Nixon, you pack your bags up, the game is over. This is, when the United States went off the gold standard. And I think, to me, it was confessional in some ways. Why is he talking to me? I'm not this guy. Yeah, I'm an author, big deal. And I had somewhat of a reputation back then, but why me is he telling this to? And as I saw it, and as you see it today, what he said back then is, oh yeah, you can see it happening right now. You pick up today's or yesterday's Financial Times, and you read about how now the politicians in the United States are all talking about income inequality. If you talked about income inequality back then, you were a socialist, a Marxist, or a communist. You look what's going on around the world with all of the young people out of work and all of the revolts that are going on. What he was saying back then is now. To me, that's the importance of it.
All right. Well,
what sounded like lunacy is now predictable.
Well, let's go back to that day on the 22nd November 1963 and look at the state of America then. At that time, there were more banks opening up across the United States than any other time. Personal income had risen at the time. There was new money from oil. There was the beginning of the space race. They called it the Golden Age. Did it end that day, do you think, when President Kennedy was shot? A lot of people say that was the end of the good times.
Yes, that's when it ended. Because under Eisenhower, there was no war. Under Eisenhower, there was movement towards civil rights, even though people think there wasn't. Under Eisenhower, he warned that the military-industrial complex was going to destroy the nation, rob us of the genius of the scientists, sweat of the laborers, and future of the children. So yes, it ended with Kennedy, and then when Nixon came in, it was the beginning of the end. So it was the end of America. There was a spirit. And I was a kid. I'll tell you a funny story. I grew up in the Bronx and in Yonkers. And I went to Catholic school. I was about 12, 13 years old when Kennedy got elected. And a bunch of us kids jumped on the bus, and we went down to Larkin Plaza, which was in Getty Square in Yonkers, because Kennedy was going to speak there. And, I'm a kid. And as his car is leaving, it wasn't motorcades like today, all this stuff. His car was leaving. I ran behind it and reached over the hood and touched his hand. And now as I think back, and here I am with Connally, how many years later? No, it was a different spirit in this country. And it's lost. It's gone. It's dead.